So this video is my entire React Hooks course compiled into a single video. So it's going to be going over the following hooks, and it's just going to run back to back to back. Now, if you want to, below I'm going to put links to each one of the individual hooks if you're interested in just a single hook. Otherwise, stay tuned to watch the entire video where we go through all the hooks. So this is the beginning of my React hook series where we're going to be going one by one through each hook and explaining not only how to use it, but why you might want to, and some of the advantages they have over class components. In this video, we're going to be going over the useState hook. Now, if you want to follow along, I'm going to be using create react app, so I recommend in your terminal, go ahead and run this command, npx create react app, and then the name of your project. So I already ran this command, and I have the project up here, and I have app.js open, and I just cleaned up some of the cruft. Now I'm going to go ahead and just do yarn start to run this project and just have it running in the background as we do stuff. Alright, so the first thing that I wanted to go over is with hooks is that we now need to only use these with, or we can only use these with functions. We cannot use them with class components. So we can either write a function like so, or you can write a function like this. Either one works. You can use arrow functions or regular functions. You can both use hooks inside of them. Just comes down to preference. The next thing you need to know, you can put these things inside of functions, but there's some rules around them. I'll link this below, all the rules, and you can read through them. But these are the main ones here. And basically, you can't nest hooks inside of loops, conditions, or functions. Now, the nice thing about this is they have some ESLint rules for this. So it's going to actually tell us when we do stuff wrong, because we have, well, you're going to need an ESLint VS Code plugin, I believe, to see it in here. But also, it's going to be caught by create react app. So what I mean by that, so I can say if true, useState. We say react.useState. Right, so this is the useState hook that I'm just calling right here. You'll notice we got red squigglies here. You'll get this if you have ESLint configured and you have it, the plugin in VS Code. You can hover over this and I can see React hooks is called conditionally. React hooks must be called in the exact same order in every component render. So basically, you cannot nest it in if statements and all that jazz. And I think if I come over here, hit save, we should also see it. You also get these warnings in your browser as well if you don't have the VS Code extension. Okay, so those are the rules around hooks. Let's go ahead and dig into this useState. So I have it, I'm just calling it like this. I can also call it Destructure up here, useState. I'm just a little cleaner call right there. So this is what we're going to use now. This is the replacement for state for class components. We use this thing called useState. So here we can call as our first parameter the initial value that it's going to store. So for example, I can say the initial value should be is 10. And I can also, if I want to, have a function that returns the initial value. So the reason why you may want to do this is if you have a computation that's really expensive. So if we have like a function up here that's like expensive initial state, and it does something like, for example, it does a bunch of for loops or whatever, you may want to call it like this. And that way this is only called on the first time and not on every single time the component renders. So that's good to note. You can basically only have this run on the initial value. All right, so this is going to return an array. And you're never going to see people actually do it like this. You're going to see everyone destructure the array like this. And the first value is the value of the state. So here I can say, you can call it count. Let's do a counter. That's a good first example. And the second value is a function that lets you update the count. Usually people call it set count or whatever the name of it is. And just for simplicity's sake, let's go back to just using 10 here. So here we're going to render count. And then we're also going to have a button here to press, and then we can update our count. All right, button plus on click. And here we're going to say set count, and we can say count plus 1. So we're using the value here, and then we're incrementing it. All right, and we can plus, and we can see it increments, and that is how we're storing the state for this counter. The other good thing you should know about set count is similar to set state, you can actually pass in a function to this. So instead of grabbing count from up here, I can pass in an updater function. So what an updater function is, it's going to take a single parameter, and you can take, and this is what the current state is. So in this case, count. I could also name this current count, and I can say, and here we want to return the new state. So I'm saying the current count plus 1. All right, so we'll give that a save. So this is a good idea to use this to avoid kind of like race condition things and having 2 updates happen at the same time and the updates get overwritten. But anyway, that's a side note. So those are the 2 ways you can call setCount here, and it's going to work exactly the same way, just incrementing the count there. So those are setCount. The other good thing to know about useState is it works slightly different than setState. So let's say we have count in here, which is 10. And so I'm now going to destructure this to have count there. We have setCount here, and I want another value in here, which is called like count2. We're just going to be real basic, and that's going to be 20. So now let's say I want to increment the count here, but I only want to increment count2. So I'm going to say count1, count2, and let's destructure count2. So again, you can pretty much store anything you want in here. So we are now storing an object, and here I'm destructuring that object, grabbing the counts. And I don't know why I went back over there. This update function now needs to be fixed. So here we can say we could call it state. We could call it current state. This is now an object. So what we can do, if we want to increase a new count, is say current state.count plus 1. Now, if you're used to this .setState in class components, you'll know that this update will happen and this count2 value won't change. But in hooks, it's a little bit different. As we see, when I increment this value disappeared. And that's because it does not do any merging of the objects. All it does is it takes this value and sets it as its state. Meaning, if you want to keep any of the other values that are inside of the object, you have to do ... current state. Right? You have to keep all the values that were in this state beforehand. Right? So do I just kill it? Oh yeah, because I need to put this up here. There we go. Because what I need, I'm putting the value of count and count2 into the object, and then I want to overwrite the count value. And now 20 stays there. I could also, if you don't want to use ... syntax, you can see this as count2 is now equal to current state.count. So basically, if you store an object in useState here, note that you will need to, whenever you update it, provide all the keys. The other thing about useState is you can use multiple of these things. So there's no reason why we can't just say, instead of using an object here, break these up. All right, so I'm going to do count and count2 and do 20. So you can have as many useStates as you want up here. So I have one for the value 10, one for the value 20, and this is the setCount. And so this simplifies things. So now when I call setCount, all I need to return is a new value for the first count here. And this just won't change count2 over here. All right, just doesn't affect it. So if I wanted to increment both of them, when I hit the plus, give that a save, I can say setCount and then setCount2. All right, and yep, we can use that exact same updater function there, and that should work. So now you have kind of a little bit of a decision whether you should split things out into multiple useStates or you should use a single useState and use an object. In general, what I do is if I'm going to update both values at the same time like I am here, I'll usually combine them into an object. If I'm only calling one at a time, I'll usually split them up. All right, so that's kind of the basics of useState. I kind of want to now go into why does anyone care about this? Why are these useState hooks useful? And it really comes into defining your own custom logic and being able to extract this logic in the hook and use it all over the place. So one thing you may be doing in your application a ton is forms. So we're going to take a look at a form example. So we'll get rid of these counts, and we're going to create an input field here, and we're going to display an email and a password. And we're going to say type password. All right, and we'll get rid of the button. So to basically represent this form, I could have a email and a password, and I could say set email and set password. And they're going to default to empty strings. And then I'm going to say the value is equal to email, and then on change, I get the event, and I say set email is equal to the event.target.value. And I can copy this logic, and I can put it on the password. But this I'm going to call set password. Right, and we could do this for all these fields, but if you've used, and we should set the value here. But if you're familiar with React, we don't have to do this, and this is kind of time consuming for each field. But here we can come in here and type some stuff in, and we can see the values. So cool. So how can we do this in a better way? Well, we can extract these hooks into our own custom hook, which handles the state for us. So we're going to create a new hook over here, which I'm going to call useForm.js. So you'll notice the syntax for hooks is you have the use in front, or the naming convention I should say, is you say use and then whatever it is. So use form, because form state is what I'm storing here. So I'm going to say export const use form. And so this is my own custom hook, and this is where things get cool. So now I can put stuff inside of here, for example, hooks. So I'm going to stick this over here. And now instead of storing it like this, I'm going to store it a little bit differently. So here I'm going to say initial values, and we're going to store the initial values in the state here. I also need to import this. Will it let me auto import it? No, it won't. Shame. Import from React. All right, so the initial values we get here, so these are some form values. I'm going to call them values, and then we can say that call this set values here. So now I can return some stuff from my hooks. First, I'm going to return the values here. You'll notice also I'm choosing to return an object here. This is just preference. You could also return an array if you wanted to and match the syntax of useState. This really just up to you. And maybe we can do that just to show you both ways. So we have values here, and then let's say we want to pass in an onChange function, and that way we can handle it for us. So here I'm going to say e, and what we're going to do is we're going to say set values, and we're going to keep all the values inside of there, and then we're going to say e.target.name is equal to e.target.value. So basically, based on the name of the input field, we'll update the value of that value in the form. All right, so now we can use this useForm hook over here. So now I'm going to say useForm, and the initial values for this, I'm going to say email is an empty string and password is an empty string. And then here I have values and I have handle change. So now I can say values.email, values.password, and for the on change here, I can say handle change. And handle change here. And it's going to update based on the names that I have here. So I can come over here, I can type some stuff, and it works just fine now. And so we were able to encapsulate that logic inside of this little function that I made here. And so now I can use this function or use my hook in other components, and it has no UI associated to it. All it has is the logic, right? And the logic of how we want to store state. And so that is pretty cool, and that is really the big advantage with hooks. Is so now we don't have to use a rendered, the thing where you do, like, for example, a formic library, and I wrap it like this. So again, this kind of hook you would ideally use, this needs to be a fragment. Again, this may be a hook that you get from a form library, but it's good to know how this works, and it's good to know that we can now use hooks like this instead of using rendered props like this. So I usually use formic for forms, and it'll usually look like this. And now I don't have to do that. Especially gets ugly when I have multiple of these, and I have like maybe some rendered props nested inside of them. So this is where hooks shine, and we can easily have two forms here, and it doesn't get real ugly. Values 2, handle change 2, and maybe this is first name, last name. Again, I don't know why you'd want to do two forms like that. We could just mash them into one, but you get the idea. We can have tons of hooks just sitting up here, and then we can create our own custom hooks and put the logic and reuse that and not have to share any kind of the UI of what it looks like. It's very easy to share the logic. So there you go. That is useState and why it is useful. In the next video, we're going to take a look at useEffect. So we're going to be taking a look at the useEffect hook. This one is very useful in a lot of situations, but it can be kind of tricky to get used to. So we're going to start off with a basic example and work our way up in complexity. So in our application here, I'm going to say useState, or I mean useEffect, and I'm going to pass a function inside of it. And let's go ahead and import it up here. So the basic usage of useEffect is every time this component re-renders or is rendered, this function will get called. So we can see that if we add a console log here and say render. And now if we go over to our code, you can see it's rendered once. And as I type in this, it's going to render a bunch. Type in this, it's going to render even more. Now, everything on top of this is basically ways to get this to render less and to clean up after a render has happened. So if we want stuff to be called less, and by I don't mean render less, I mean for this function to be called less. So for example, what if I don't want this to be called on every render? I only want it to be called whenever I change the password. We can do it like so. We can say comma and then pass a array here, and we can say values.password. So now whenever I change the password, this render console log is going to fire off. So here, and initially it's going to fire off as well. So whenever I make a change, see render changes, but if I change the email, this does not change. So what did I just do? Well, the second parameter here is called the dependency array that you can pass in. And so here you can pass in all the values that your effect depends on. And so these values, whenever they change, the effect fires off again. And so that's the gist of it. And we can put more than one if we want to. In this case, we have only two values, but we could add another one here. Let's do first name. First name. First name. Values.firstname. And give that a save. And I can say values.password and values.email. So now my effect depends on the email and the password, but not the first name. And I need placeholders. So placeholder, first name. All right, so we see it. We see the functions getting called, functions getting called, functions now not getting called. Now the thing to note about this is doing a shallow comparison of the values, and whenever the values change, this is going to be recalled. Now, by shallow comparison, I mean if we were to put something like this object here, the object is going to change on every single render, the reference anyway, or a new object is going to be created. So this is going to be called every single time. In a future video, we're going to cover how we can avoid such problems like this. And I'm also going to link to a video that I did about problems you may occur with useEffect with closures. It's more of an advanced topic that you may want to hit later on, and also a great article by Dan about useEffect. All right, so that's that. The next thing to note about useEffect is you can kind of replace component did amount and component will unmount with this. So if we don't pass in any values to useEffect here, we can now have this console log once when it mounts, and that's it. So doing renders is not going to recall that function there. And I can do a cleanup function, which means we return that function from the inside of the function here. And this is called the cleanup function. Inside of here, we can add all our cleanup logic. And this is going to unmount. We can't really see this because it's going to happen when the component disappears. But if I were to create, say, another component here called hello.js, and in this component, if we toggled it, if we showed it and then didn't show it, we're going to see it unmount and remount each time. All right, so let's copy this over. Export const hello. And we're going to say div hello. And we can just say react.useEffect. And here I'm going to say hello. We're going to say show hello, set hello, set show hello. And we're going to say useState. And by default, we will show it. So here I'm going to wrap this and conditionally render hello. So show hello. And then we're going to toggle it on and off. And we're just going to negate it. So now we can see that this has rendered, and if I were to toggle it and it disappears, you'll notice the unmount's called. Toggle it on, you can see it render and unmount again. So we can see the component mounting and unmounting, and those two console logs go off, and we can see that happening. Now the cool thing about this is it doesn't just have to be when it mounts and unmounts. So what do I mean by that? Well, if we go back to our example over there, we can ignore hello again. By the way, if you don't know how to comment out blocks like I'm doing, this might be hard to follow. So command and then slash is how you do that. Probably control slash on Windows. So if we go back to our useEffect here, let's say I want this to fire off whenever values.email changes. Well, whenever values or the email changes, it's going to clean up. It's going to call this cleanup function. All right, so we render. I press A. You see it's going to unmount. We're not really unmounting. We're just cleaning up the old value, and then we have a new value here. So that's pretty cool. So that's pretty powerful that we can do that, not just on mount and unmount. We can do it whenever the dependencies change. We can clean up anything we need to with the old stuff. Okay, so these are kind of some basic examples and the basic fundamentals. Now I thought it would be good to show you some use cases of this and regular apps. So the first one I wanted to go over was with events. So for example, I may want to add event listener. So we're going to do mouse move. And this is a nice one because when this mounts, I want to start listening to the mouse. And basically what I want to do is just display the current location of the mouse. So I'm going to say const on mouse move. And just to start, I'm going to console log the event here. And so I can pass in on mouse move. And then I want to clean up this function when I'm done. I can say window.remove event listener mouse move on mouse move. So it's pretty nice that we can use this useEffect here, and we can have this when it first mounts, add it, and when it unmounts, clean it up by removing this. Another thing I haven't mentioned yet, but I guess I'll mention it after we show this real quick. So we can see as I move my mouse around, we can see all these console logs of the values updating. So effects are a great place to add event listeners and remove them. And I don't even think we need to worry about showing the value on the screen. This gives you the gist of it. But what I wanted to show you was you can have more than one useEffect on your component, and they fire off in order. All right, so this is going to be mount 1, and then mount 2. And again, you can have as many useEffects as you want. You can see 1, 2, they fire one after the other. All right, so the next one that I want to do is to fetch from an API. So the API I'm going to fetch from is the numbers API. And so I'm going to copy this URL. So here we just pass in a number, and this is going to give us access to a fact about that number. So we're going to create a custom hook for this. I'm going to call it the useFetch hook. I'm going to say export const useFetch. And what this is going to take is a URL. So I'm actually just going to paste this over here. And I'm going to get rid of some of this stuff. We don't really need these anymore. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to, whenever this URL changes, we want to fetch some data. So we're going to say useEffect. Dang it, we don't get auto-completion JavaScript for this. That's sad. All right, useEffect. So I'm going to add the URL as a dependency. So this function is going to be called whenever the URL changes. So here is where I'm going to call fetch. And I'm going to pass in the URL. Now, this is going to usually, if I was writing this, I would make this asynchronous. But bam, we're already getting an ESLint warning here. It tells us that you need to return, it's just telling you it's not exhaustive. I'm surprised this ESLint warning's coming up. It probably shows a good example here. It says await there. Anyway, the point I was trying to make here is you can't put async right here in the function and use await. It doesn't like it, so we're not going to do it like that. We're just going to call fetch, and we can do .then. We could also have a function in here that we make asynchronous, and then you can call it like that. So it's up to you. You have those two choices of how you want to do it. I'm just going to do .then syntax. All right, so we're going to fetch from the URL, and I'm going to say x dot. Now, usually I would say x.json, but this particular API is .text, so .text, and we're going to say .then, and why don't we just console log y so we see that the value is actually what it is. And so I'm just going to call our hook real quick. So we're going to say const, and it doesn't return anything yet, so we're just going to say useFetch. We're going to pass in our URL. Dang it, there we go. So here we can see our fact getting logged out here, nice. So let's make this more useful. So I want this to basically return to me the data and a true or false whether the data is loading, whether there's anything in the data. So how can we do that? Well, we can combine this with useState to store some information. So this is where you're going to see we can kind of use multiple hooks here in our custom hook. So I'm going to say set, I don't know what I want to call this. We'll just call it set data. So it's going to have data inside of here, which is going to be null by default, and loading, which is going to be false. And we're going to return, I guess maybe we want this to be true by default. And we're going to return data. This is kind of bad naming convention because data.data here, maybe I should call this state, and we'll call it set state. All right, so here we want to say set state, the data is equal to y, and loading is equal to false. And then at the very start here, I want to say set state, data is null, and loading is true. So at the beginning, we're going to set loading to true, and then we're going to fetch the result when it comes in. We are going to say passing the data and loading is false. So now here I can display this. I can say, just do it at the top. You can say, if we're loading, we're going to say ... Otherwise, we're going to display the data. In this case, it's just going to be a string. And here we can see that displaying nicely there. And now the next thing that I want to do is I want this URL to change whenever or the data to change whenever this URL changes. So what I can do is I can add a little counter. So we can say count, set count, could start at 0, and we can say div count is equal to count. We can say increment. And so now we're going to get a new fact every time I increment the counter. So we can use the updater function here for our set counts. And then this is what's going to change. So now here is going to be the current count. All right, so 0 is the atomic number. We increment, we get a 1, and we can see it populate here. Now I think what's happening is you saw that there's like a little bit of a jitter. I think it's because we're displaying loading. So maybe we want to say if there's data, if there's not data, display loading. Otherwise that maybe get a little smoother. No, oh, you know, it resets the data every time right here. So maybe we can get it this even smoother. We can say state.data. So if we currently have data, we can pass that in there. All right, so now we have a little bit smoother of transition, but there we go. Notice how every time I increment this, looks like bad gateway 10. Looks like we hit a problem in the API. Maybe we're making too many requests. But either way, we've made 10 requests. Every time we increment the counter, it is going to update the state here, and it's passing that value to our useFetch, which is updating these values. So we're starting to see where this can be kind of fun and kind of useful with this. Now, a few things I wanted to note about this useFetch. First, let's say I didn't include this URL. Then this would not, be called every time the URL changes. But you'll notice we have this nice little warning from ESLint for us, the exhaustive dependencies, because it sees that we're using the URL here, but we didn't include it here. So you may notice that you're going to be getting that, and that's a nice little reminder to add those in here. The other thing is, you'll notice how I'm using set state here. I should probably add set state to the dependencies. So yes, you can add dependencies, functions as dependencies, and you probably should be. And again, that's where you have to be careful if the function is changing every time. The other thing to note is you can infinitely recur if, infinitely just call each other, is if you call set state here, and this triggers this to change. So you can just have it infinitely call each other, and the effect keeps getting calling. So you have to be very careful about that as well. So make sure your dependencies are not changing based on what the useEffect call is, at least not over and over. All right, so that is the useFetch. The next thing that I want to go over, last thing, is saving the state. So I found the hook very nice to do this. Is, for example, if I want to persist this to say local storage. So I can make a useEffect hook here. And so let's say I want to persist the value of count. So here I can say I want this function to be called at every time the count changes. And I can say local storage dot set item. Dang it. There we go. Local storage. And here I can say key. I'm just going to call it count. And I'm going to say json.stringify the count in case I ever want to change the count to something else besides the number later for some reason. And yeah, it's as easy as that. So now every time the count changes, it's going to set the count in local storage. And now I can change the initial value of the count here by saying local storage.getItem count. And we can do a json.parse. And again, we just have a single value of count, but this algorithm would work for, say, objects and arrays as well, since we're using parse and stringify. Now, I don't want JSON parse and local storage.getItem to be called on every single render. So this is a good opportunity for us to use the initializer function of useState. All right, so let's see this in action and see if this works. So we're going to refresh here. I'm going to increment this to 3, and we do a refresh, and you notice the value of 3 is there. So again, every time I increment here, it is updating the count in local storage, and then when we reset or refresh, is reading that value with this initializer function here. So there you go. That is kind of an introduction to useEffect and some of the things that you can do with it that are pretty useful. As you can see, it kind of has a little bit more flexibility than what you had with the class components, and it's kind of a new way to think about calling your data and combining these things together, and we can do all kinds of chained logic together, and we can have multiple useEffects. Because right now we have this useFetch or useFetch, which has useEffect in it, and then we have this other useEffect at the bottom here. We could also be, say, for example, caching data that we're getting from useFetch if we want to, and do all kinds of stuff. But that just gives you a little introduction to this, and I hope that was helpful. So we're going to be taking a look at the useRef hook. Now this one, we're going to start with the most obvious use case, which is storing a reference to a component, say an input field or a div or something, and then being able to reference that node in your application. So for example, what we're going to do is I'm going to make a button, and whenever I click the button, it's going to focus the input field here. And so we can use a reference for that. And then we're going to get into some of the other use cases you can use useRef for. All right, so let's start with the thing that you're going to use it pretty much the most for. So I'm going to say const input ref. So we're going to create a new variable, and I'm going to say useRef here. So this is our new hook, and I'm going to say useRef and import it from React. So now what I do with this is I can pass this to whatever component I want to get the reference of it. So in case my input field here, and this works pretty much the same as create reference if you're used to class components in React. So I pass it in here, and then I have reference to this input field now. So what I can do, I can have a button that says focus, and we're going to do on click. And I'm just going to start by logging what the input ref is. Now you'll notice we have to say .current to get the current value of the reference. So I'm going to say click, and you can see I have reference to the input DOM node, if you will, and we can do whatever we want with that. We could call any methods on there, or read the values of stuff. What I'm going to do is I'm going to say .focus on it. And so I'm going to come over here, and when I hit focus, you see my input field is focused over here. And so that's the main use case I would say for useRef, or the one that I use the most, is getting reference to some kind of React component and then being able to use that somewhere in my application where I need to like imperatively call stuff, and this will not cause a re-render, for example. You can just focus, or if we need to do get any value, like get bounding rectangle, I think. I forget the name of it. We're not going to be able to call it, but you can do all kinds of stuff with that. The next thing I want to go over is, and why don't I just keep the .focus there, is the other stuff you can use the reference for. This is basically anything you want to store a reference to. It doesn't have to be a DOM node or a React component, I guess. We can store, for example, integers in here. So what I'm going to do, another use case I use for it, is to store the number of times a component has rendered. So why don't we do this for the hello component? Let's bring this back. So I'm going to say renders, and I'm going to store an integer inside of this reference. So let's import it. And then all I'm going to do is just console log, and I'm going to say hello renders. And I'm going to say this will just render. We need to say .current to get reference to the 0 there. This is just going to render 0 every single time. What I'm going to add is ++, so it increments every time the console log is shown. Now the thing about this current is we can update the value of it whenever we want to, and it's not going to cause a re-render. So if you were to have like instant variables on your classes, this is the same use case. You can put stuff on there like that, which is not tied to React re-rendering. For example, instead of putting in your state, you can store in a ref if you want to. All right, so let's just uncomment this right here. Oops. And take a look at that. All right, I need to just uncomment these one at a time, I think. There we go. Let's add a show hello back. And we're going to say useState true. All right, so we can clear all this stuff. And of course, as I'm typing here, we can see how many times hello is rendered. We can toggle it off. It's gone. Toggle it back. It restarts there. And again, we can store whatever we want in this, so it doesn't have to just be numbers. It can be objects, it can be functions, whatever we like. So another use case that I use for this is with useFetch. So it's helpful to know whether a component has unmounted, and so we can prevent an error when we try setting state on a component that is has been unmounted. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's basically cause an error real quick. So I'm going to move the logic of calling the API and displaying the numbers over here. I'm going to move it over to our hello example. So I'm going to just move this right here and copy this all over. And let's import useState, useEffect, and we can import our useFetch. And I'm going to just bring that over to my hello example. Oh, dang it. I undo copy again. Okay, so now I'm basically just put all that code inside of hello here. And the reason why I'm doing that is I want to unmount hello while the data is loading, and then we try updating the state, and that's going to cause a problem. So I basically want to make this extra slow. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to say set timeout, and we're going to wait for some amount of time. Let's make it 2 seconds. And then we are going to update the state. All right, so let's take a look at our example here. So now if I increment, it's just going to take a second, and then this should update. And let's go to our hello. We're kind of done with this example here. I'm going to comment out the useRef for that. All right, so let's go to our problem now. So the problem that occurs is if I increment and then I toggle this off. Well, also if this fails. So let's refresh and try that again. All right, so we're going to increment, toggle this off. So you'll notice what happens is it's going to try updating the state when the component is gone, and we get this little warning in React. So if you've seen that warning before, that's why. You tried calling setState when the component is gone. So we can use references to help us solve this problem. So now what I can say is I can say const isCurrent is usually the name I'll give it. useRef, and we're going to put this inside of our useFetch hook. So by default, I'm going to say it is current. So say isCurrent is true. And then I'm going to say useEffect. And I'm going to say empty bracket here. And I'm going to return a cleanup function. So this function is only going to be called when the component is going to unmount. And so we're going to just say isCurrent.current is equal to false. And so whenever this value is false, we know the component is about to unmount. So in our code, right before we set state, we can say if isCurrent.current, then we call setState. So what's going to happen is it's going to load the value just fine when we increment here. But now if I increment and I toggle it off, what's going to happen when the data loads is it's no longer going to call setState because the current value is false. Now you could also go about trying to cancel the fetch statement, but this is another way you can know whether the value of the current component has been unmounted yet, is you can store that in a ref. So that is basically the basics of useRef. You can store whatever value you want in here, and then you access it with .current. We didn't do an example with functions, but again, I could store a function here that I like. We can console. Let's just make a function real quick and see what that looks like. Let's go to our app here. And we're going to say the hello function. And we're just going to console log hello. And so there's some use cases where you want to put this stuff on a ref that comes up. So we can say hello.current and call it like that. So now when I push focus, it's going to say hello and focus at the same time. And again, we can store objects, whatever you like. Treat it as you would, for example, on a class component, fields or instant variables that you would store on the class, as opposed to stuff you'd store in the state. But there you go. That is the introduction to useRef. So we're going to be taking a look at the useLayoutEffect hook. Now this one has a niche use case, which I only use on rare occasions. Now the key thing to know about this is this line right here from the docs. It says the signature is identical to the useEffect hook, but it fires synchronously after all DOM mutations. And so this part is how it differs from useEffect. And in practice, what that means is it's good for example, if we want to measure the box of something or measure the width of a DOM component after a render occurs, or any kind of thing where we rely on getting information from the DOM and the useEffect, we want to try out useLayoutEffect. In practice, a lot of times I'm usually taking this advice right here where it says we recommend starting with useEffect first and only trying useLayoutEffect if that causes a problem. So in practice, that's usually what I do, but I have found a pattern of where useLayoutEffect has been helpful for me. So we're going to be taking a look at an example of that. So I'm going to measure the dimensions of this input field. So I want to know how wide and how tall and all that stuff. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by just saying useLayoutEffect here. And we're going to do just on first mount. And then we're going to import it up here. And here I'm going to say console.log input ref. We're already storing the ref up here. So we have useRef input ref, and we are passing that to this input here. Ref is equal to input ref. And then here I'm going to say get bounding client rect. So this is a function that basically gives you the dimensions of this component or this DOM node. So if we come over here, and this should be input ref dot current. We can see in our log, we can see the dimensions. So here we can see the width and the height, and we can also see positioned on the page where it's at, top, left, right, bottom, and the X and Y coordinates. So this can be helpful for doing different sorts of stuff. And that's the basic gist of it. Whenever I want to get a value, for example, the measurements of a DOM node, I will use useLayoutEffect instead of useEffect. So let's look at another example that is a little bit more practical. So I'm going to go ahead and just console or comment this out and go over to the hello example over here. So here, for example, I might want to know how wide or how tall this div is right here, because this data dynamically changes. Whenever I increment the number, we're going to get a new fact, and so this is going to be new text, and it's going to be a new width. So we may want to know the width after each render. So how can we do that? And that's where useLayoutEffect can be used. So we're going to go over here to hello. I'm going to go ahead and just go to useFetch real quick and remove the timeout so this thing isn't super slow. So I'm going to just remove that, and I'm going to keep everything else the same. All right, so here what I want to do is I'm going to first just put a div inside of this. And reason why I'm doing that is if I come here and I open the inspector and look at this element, you'll notice it spans the entire page. So what I want to do is in this parent element, say display flex, and that way I can see just the width of it inside this small div here. So we're going to say display flex. And then here I'm going to store a reference to this div. So I'm going to say const div ref is equal to useRef. We're going to pass that in. Ref is equal to div ref. And I'm going to get rid of this. And I'm going to say useLayoutEffect right here. And let's go ahead and import it up here. Now for the dependency, I want to remeasure this every time there is some new data. So I'm going to add data as a dependency here. And let's start by just console logging it. So I'm going to say div ref.current and .get bounding client rect. All right, so we can see in the console log here, it has a width of 368 or 386, I mean. And if we increment, you can see the width has changed now to 285. So now we can measure it each time we change it. The other thing is you may want to display something based on this. So for example, I may want to display the width. So we could store this in a useState if we want to. Let's go back to const. And so here I can say div, or let's call it rect, and set rect. is equal to useState, and it's going to be an empty object to start off. And so here I'm just going to display this information. Say rect or JSON.stringify the rectangle. And then in the useLayoutEffect, we're going to say setRect, and let's not delete everything. SetRect. So every time we get a new piece of data, we are going to get the size of this div, and then we are going to update the state, and we are going to display the new sized rectangle. So here we can see the JSON for it, and we can display this maybe a little bit more pretty if we use a pre-tag. And then we say null2 to format it. See if that gets a little better. Nice. So now I can see the dimensions, and I can increment, and I can see we get some new values and new values for this. So that's pretty cool. And we could turn this into its own custom hook if we wanted to. So for example, we could call this thing like useMeasure.js. And here you could build this hook in a number of ways, but let's say we just pass in the ref to the use measure that we want to do it for. And let's copy this. And then what we return is the rectangle. So here we're going to import all this stuff. So import from React, useState, useRef, and useLayoutEffect. I guess we could pass in the dependencies for the useLayoutEffect as well. We could say dependencies here. And I guess React useLayout was passed as a dependency list that is not an array literal. Oh, I guess this doesn't know because it's of the type any, even though we're in JavaScript. Interesting. I guess it just says we can't statically verify, so it's giving me a warning about it. So I guess we can hit command and then period, and we can just disable this for this line because we know it's going to be okay. Or at least we are hoping it is. So now instead of using a div ref here, we can use whatever ref is passed in. So this is one way that you could write this hook. And so what do we get after we've written a hook like this? So now I could just say rectangle is equal to useMeasure, and then I pass in the div reference, and then my dependency is the data, and we can remove this, and now I can just use my useMeasure like this. So my useMeasure hook, we have the reference here to the div, and then here we have the dependency list of when we want it to remeasure. So let's see this in action and see if we got this correct. Increment. And there we go, got it working nicely. We could also, if we wanted to do this, move the reference inside of useMeasure here. So let's move this inside of useMeasure. So instead of taking this as a proper there, we can say useRef. And I guess, I don't know what I want to call this. myRef maybe. And so we can pass the rectangle as the first argument and the reference as the second argument and we return this as an array. So now in our use measure over here, all we have to pass in is the dependency, and then we have the rectangle and then our div ref as the second value. So now we have this use measure hook where I can put this wherever I want to. So now I can use it in my app over here as well if I want to. So I could say use measure. And I want this to just do on initial mount. We can pass in, I guess I was going to pass in my input ref, but here we can have another one, put ref2. And we have a rectangle, and now we can pass that in here. And now we're measuring the bounds of this input box here. So now we've made like a nice little utility there, and we are measuring it with the useLayoutEffect. But there you go. That gives you kind of an idea of when you might want to use useLayoutEffect and how it works. And we made kind of a custom hook here that you can use to measure the size of components, and a few different ways you can build this hook depending on how you want it to work. So we're going to be taking a look at the useCallback hook in this video. It's good for when you want to prevent a function from being created on every single render. Now I'm going to explain what I mean by that and how this is helpful when we want to use the memo function in React. Now, for those of you that have been following along with the React Hooks series, I went ahead and I pared down the code because it was getting a little cluttered. So here I have a single div and a hello component that I'm rendering, and in hello we just have a div that says hello. So we're going to be starting from this place, and we're going to start off by passing a function down to our hello component here. So I'm going to create some state, and we're going to start with just a simple counter. So I'm going to say count and set count, and we're going to use the useState hook. So now, normally if I wanted to say pass a function down to hello, for example, an increment function, I might do it like this. So I'm going to create a lambda here, and I'm going to say set count, count plus 1. Now you'll notice, because I've created a lambda here, this is what I meant by creating a function on every single render. Every time app is rendered, this is going to be recreated, this function right here. So, and I also want to say, for example, display the count maybe in this component. So I'm going to say count is that, and then in my hello component, I want to use this increment function some way. So I'm going to say button, and we're going to say increment. And every time they click the hello button, we want to increment. So we'll give that a save, and then let's take a look at the code here. So now if I say hello and I press it, we're just incrementing. So nothing special is happening so far. But the key thing to note is that this function is being created on every single render. So usually that's not a problem. With the current code we have, not a problem whatsoever. But what does cause a problem is when we want to use something like React Memo. So when I say react.memo on this component, I want this component to only re-render when increment changes. But the problem is increment's changing all the time. And so we can actually see this happening whenever I add some logic here to print out whenever this component re-renders, which we can do, which we saw in a previous video. Here we can say renders is equal to useRef, which starts at 0, useRef, and we can console log renders and renders plus plus. So now we can see, and this should be renders.current. And if we want to, we could stick this in its own custom hook, since we may want to use this several times. So we use count renders. So I'm going to say export const use count renders. And I'm going to paste this code here. And now we can put this, we can keep the logic in this hook. So now all I have to say is use count renders. And now we're going to get a console log every time this hook is rendered, or every time that component is rendered. So we can see a hello, and now we can see that each time I increment count, this is increasing, right? Which we can actually improve this, because this function is not changing at all, right? The function I want to do the same thing on every single time. The only thing that's changing is this count variable here. So how can we prevent this? This is where useCallback comes in. So I can say useCallback, and it's probably good for me to explain this memo if you've never seen this before. What memo does is basically it just compares the props, and if the props have changed, then it's going to re-render the component. So by default, React will always re-render the component if the parent is changed. If the parent's rendering, this guy will render as well. But when we add memo, it's going to check only re-render when the props are changed. So we're going to see the difference in that once we use the useCallback. So I'm going to say increment is equal to useCallback. And how useCallback works is we pass in a function, and then its dependencies in this little bracket array right here. So here I'm going to pass in set count. And now if I pass in the two dependencies, they are count and set count. And now I can pass this in here. So how useCallback works is whenever the count or set count changes, this function will be recreated and put in this variable basically. So now increment's only changing when these two values either of those are changed. So we haven't quite fixed it yet, because if I come over here, we can see it's still rendering every count. And the reason for that is because we're depending on count right now. So we can eliminate this dependency by using the updater function that is available to us when we call setCount here. We can do it like this. So now what we have is if we come over here, I increment the count here, you'll notice the function is never changing, and so this never gets re-rendered. And so this is where useCallback shines, is when we want to prevent functions from basically changing the value. And a lot of times the reason why you want to prevent that from happening is when you're using React.memo, because it's going to check the reference of something. The other case where you may want to use useCallback is in a case where you're using, for example, like useEffect, and you have some logic and you need to depend on this increment function. So you don't want this function to be changing all the time, or else the useEffect will keep firing off. So those are like the two places where you'll tend to use these the most. The other thing to note is we can add parameters to this if we want. So for example, I can pass in, and so that'll be the first parameter to increment. So we can increment by an amount. So in my hello function over here, I can go ahead and say increment by 5, for example. And so that is going to be passed into our useCallback function. All right, so now we increment by 5. The other thing you can do is you can actually return values from this, or you could return the. I guess we can't really return the new count because we're doing an updater function here, but you could return some value. But usually when you're using useCallback, you're not really needing to return something. So I don't think I've ever needed to return something. But note that's available to you in cases where you need to. So the last thing that I kind of want to go over is a more practical example of where this comes up. I found this comes up the most when I want to do a looping over an array of something. So let's say we want to, I'm just going to create a favorite nums array, which is going to be 7, 21, and 37 is going to be our favorite numbers for today. So let's say I want to loop over these numbers here. So I'm going to say favorite nums.map, and we're going to say n, and here we're going to return, and here I'm going to create a square class component. Actually, no, it's not going to be a class component, it's going to be a regular component. And I'm just going to copy our hello example. Alright, so we're going to render the square component here. And let's say, for example, when I click on the square, I want to increment it by the favorite number. So I may do it like on click, I want to increment by n. Right, so this is a situation where, again, I'm creating a lambda. Usually not that big of a deal, but if I wanted to, for example, memoize the square, then things get messed up. So it really just comes up when you want to memoize things, or you want that function to not always, where it matters when this is getting changed on every single render. When that matters, that's when you kind of want to use useCallback. So we're going to use our useCount renders, and let's just comment it out from our app over here, or from hello, because we don't want to get too much stuff on our output. So in square over here, I'm going to display the favorite number, which is going to be n, and we're also going to display n here. And let's say we have an on click. So I kind of showed this method with the hello example, but we can see this again. And we're going to pass n down here. All right, so let's see what this just looks like. We also need a key. So now if I increment by these numbers, it's going to increment the count. You'll notice it's rendering each one of those every single time I click on a number for that many times. Now, if we're doing a square here and we have on click, that may be the standard way we want to do it. But this case is we're creating a function on every render, and so it's causing it to render. So the approach that I usually take in these situations is I'll pass the increment down. And let's say we do increment, and then we don't have the on click logic. right here, we put the onClick logic inside of the square. So here I have onClick, and instead of that, we're going to say increment now. And then we're going to say increment, and we can pass in there. So now if we come over here, you'll notice it's not going to re-render every single time now, because we're just not creating this function every render now. So this is kind of approach that has come up a lot for me. Whenever I'm mapping over an array of items, I'll usually pass down the function, pass down the data, and then inside of that function, if I'm memoizing it, I'll then have the logic, for example, the onClick logic here, where I call increment like this because we need this information there. So there you go. That gives you an introduction into how useCallback works and when you would want to use it. So we're going to be taking a look at the useMemo hook in this video. This is a hook that's great when you want to optimize computed values. We're going to start by looking at an example without it, and then we're going to add it in and see how it's actually helping. And that's actually something I would recommend doing whenever you're using it for real in a project, is start without using it, and then if you see like something is being slow or recomputed too many times, then think about adding this hook in. So what we're going to do is we're going to start from here. I have a single React component, and I have a counter. So I have a useState, which is set to 0, and then I have my count, set count, and I'm displaying the count, and I have a button where you click and it increments the count. So the task that we're going to do is we're going to start by fetching from this Kanye REST API. So what this is a list of quotes that Kanye has tweeted, and we're going to fetch this JSON file here. So I'm going to copy this URL, and I'm going to display the longest word he uses in his tweet. So we're going to compute the largest word, most number of characters, a single word that he uses in one of his tweets is. So we're going to start by fetching that information. So I'm going to say const data is equal to useFetch. And I'm going to pass this in, that URL. And it's not letting me auto import. I'm going to import from useFetch. Now useFetch is a hook that I created in a previous video. If you are curious how this was created, I recommend going and watch my useEffect video in this React Hook series. Basically what we do is we store the state, which is null by default, and we also tell you whether it's loading. And then in a useEffect hook here, we fetch the data from that URL and then set the data in the state here, and that state is what's returned. So what we're going to have is the data is going to be null at first, and then we're going to get a array of strings. An array of strings is what we get back from this REST API. So what I want to do with that is I want to compute, and we can create a function inside of here. I wanted to also mention that, so I'm going to say const compute longest word. I wanted to mention that I usually write arrow functions like this, but we could also create a function inside of here like this. That's totally a fine thing to do as well. So we're going to say compute longest word, and we are going to say if we don't have any data, it's going to return an empty array. Otherwise, we're going to say let longest word is equal to an empty string, and we're going to return the longest word. And here we're going to iterate through all the data. So we're going to say for each sentence, and I'm actually going to say sentence.split by space, and then we're going to do for each word. So basically we're going to iterate through every sentence, and then we're going to split that sentence by space, which will give us an array of words, and then we're going to loop through each word, and then for each word we're going to say if word.length is greater than longest word.length, then longest word is equal to word. And that's it. And then we're going to return longest word from this. And then I'm going to just add a console log at the top here. I'm going to add it right here actually. This is the more important one. Computing longest word. And then I'm going to display this down here. So just get longest, they call it get, no, compute longest word. So we're going to give that a save. And let's take a look at this. Data.forEach is not a function. All right, let's do a console.log of what the value of data is and see where I got wrong with this. I was thinking it was going to be an array of data. You know what? Oh, it's a text file. I forgot we did that. So in my useFetch, I did x.text because the API we were dealing with was a text file, so I didn't do .json. We could change this to .json here, or in a file over here, we could say, json.stringify, or sorry, parse. All right, so we can see this is the longest word that he used in his tweets. And so you can see we are computing the longest word here. We did it once. Now you notice, what is the problem with what we're doing? So what we're doing here is we are computing the longest word. And so this is what I would call is a computed value. And this value we're computing is based on this value right here. I'm kind of just, grabbing the value based on, I'm not passing in the value through like a function here. I could do that. So it's probably a better thing to do. So here we're going to say array and array. So that's the first thing. What I was doing is I was just like directly accessing the data up there. That can sometimes cause problems with closures and JavaScript. So I usually like to pass in a parameter there. So why don't we do that real quick and pass in data here. And basically what's going to happen is if we start re-rendering, for example, if I were to increment the count here, we're going to recompute the longest word every render. So every time I increment this counter, we are doing that for loop where we're looping over and finding what this longest word is. So we're basically recomputing this value over and over again, but the value doesn't really change because the data is not changing. And so this is a situation where useMemo can be useful. But again, a lot of times we don't even have to worry about adding it in. Like right here, I don't see any performance concerns. I don't see any lag. In this situation, I might even bother making it or optimizing this. So that's something to note before you just jump in and use useMemo everywhere. It's something that I feel like you only need to use when you start feeling stuff being sluggish. So pretend this was even more values and we were getting something that was sluggish. What we could do here is we could say const longest word is equal to useMemo. And so how this hook works is the first one is a function that returns a value. In our case, we're going to have a function here, and we are going to pass in compute longest word, passing in our data. So basically, this is the function that will return the computed value. And then here we add our dependencies. And so in our case, only dependencies, well, our two dependencies actually are compute longest array and the data, right? So we could add data and compute longest array or compute longest word. Well, let's see what we did here. So the function makes dependencies of useMemo hook to fix this definition and the useCallback. Awesome. So we're actually in an ESLint warning to put this in a useCallback, which was actually what I was about to talk about. Because right now, compute longest word here is a function that's going to be recomputed on every render. So useMemo is going to do absolutely nothing right now because the value of this changes. So if I pass this in here, so what longest word will store is the value that was computed here. So whatever's returned from this function is going to be stored in longest word. So if we come over here, we can see we're computing the word every single time. And that's because this function is getting created every time, and so this dependency is being recreated every time. So there's a few things that we can do. This could cause problems, just removing it as a dependency because we use it inside of this. So I usually recommend adding it as a dependency. But we could use the first step would be to just move this outside. Now that we are passing in the parameter, there's really no reason for this particular function to be inside of our component here. So that's really what I would recommend in this situation, but we could also use useCallback in this situation if we wanted to. So just for demonstration purposes, let me show you what the useCallback could look like. And actually, let's just show that that works first. So we'll give this a save. So now if I increment this, you'll notice we are not recomputing the longest word. We only do that once. And so that's really the purpose of useMemo. If you've used reselect with Redux before, it's going to be a similar thing where you can now only have to compute things whenever the dependencies change here. So whenever the dependencies change, this value is recomputed and passed in here. And so I use useMemo on rare occasions when I need this, but a lot of times I don't even need to worry about memoizing this sort of thing. But anyway, let's look at the useCallback real quick. So I could pass this here, and I could say useCallback. And so here we're going to pass in our arrow function right here into useCallback. So over here I need to add a parentheses, and then I need to add the dependencies of this particular function, which is an empty array because we're not using any dependencies inside of here. Alright, so we can increment, and you can see you get the same effect here. It's not recomputing. I think also if you're using useCallback somewhere and you don't have any dependencies, that's probably a sign that you can actually just take the function and put it outside. So in this case, I wouldn't recommend using, we can just undo all the way up to here. I wouldn't use useCallback because there's no purpose. If you can, I would make functions like this where they are pure, they don't use any outside things, and you just pass them in as parameters, and you can stick them outside like this. That's what I would recommend for situations like this. So there you go. That is what useMemo does and when it is useful. So we're going to be taking a look at the useReducer hook. Now this hook is for storing state and is an alternative to the useState hook. So we're going to start off with a simple example and then make a more complex one to demonstrate how to use it. So to start off, we're going to import useReducer from React, and we are going to call it. So useReducer in our component right here. And how useReducer works is you pass it two parameters. And we can see that if we hover over, we can see the signature. We can pass it the reducer, which is a function, which is going to be very similar, if you're or really exactly the same as what you would do in Redux if you're familiar with that. If you're not, no worries. We're going to go over how that works. And then also the initial state, where you can pass in a function that returns the initial state as well. So the reducer is a function, so I'm going to say const, or we could say function reducer instead if we didn't want to use an arrow function. You'll notice I am creating this function outside of the component here. That's on purpose. This is a function that is pure, and we want to stick outside of our component. We don't want to create it inside. Alright, so I have my useReducer here. I'm going to pass in reducer, and I'm going to put my initial state. To start off, we're going to do something simple. We're going to do a counter. So my initial state is going to be 0. And again, if we wanted to initialize this, we could with a function. So same thing. And again, same as useState, you'd want to use a function if the initial state was took some time to compute or something like that. Alright, so in our reducer, how it works is it takes two parameters, the current state and an action. So the state is going to be whatever the current value is in the state, and the action is basically a function that gets called, and the value is going to be stored here. So what it looks like is here we're going to return a state value, whatever the value is. In this case, it's going to be count, and then a function called dispatch. So here we're going to say div count is equal to count. We can see the value of count, and then I want to create a button to increment. And we're also going to create a button to decrement. So now what do I put here? I'm going to call dispatch, and I need to call dispatch with some parameters to get this to work. So I'm going to say decrement. So basically whatever I pass to dispatch right here is going to be this parameter and the reducer. So if I were to dispatch 1, action would have the value of 1. If I dispatch 2 here, it would have the value of 2. Now there is a basically best practice or general way you see people using dispatch and reducers like this in Redux. And so we're going to follow that similar pattern. So usually how it works is you would create an object that you pass in, where you pass in a type, which is usually a string. So here is where I'm going to pass a string, and you can make this all caps if you want, or I sometimes just do all lowercase and put it there. You can also, this is something where you can store in a variable. So we could say increment is equal to increment. It really comes down to whatever you want to do there. We're going to just keep it simple and start with here, but you can follow some of the Redux best practices if you like with this. All right, so we have this object that we're passing in. We set the type increment, and that's really all we need to do. And then here I'm going to say type decrement. So now in my reducer, basically what I do is I read what the action is and I change the state accordingly. Now you can do whatever syntax you want inside of this reducer, but the most common one you'll see is a switch statement where you say action.type. And so here we're going to have different cases. So for example, when we have an increment action passed in, what should we do? Well, we should say return state plus 1. And when we get a decrement state, or action I mean, we're going to return state minus 1. And then here we're going to say default return state. And default is whenever the action is not an increment or decrement, the default thing we should do is just return the state. So let's see what happens when we do this. So now we're going to see as I increment the state and decrement the state changes. And so we basically are listening for these actions that are being dispatched. So this is what you'd call an action. And the different types, we react to them in different ways. All right, so that is the basics of useReducer. So you create a function that changes the state. A key point with this is you do not want to mutate the state inside of this. So I don't want to do state plus plus. I want to create a new version of the state that is state plus 1. So that's very important. So now the example that we're going to do is we're going to build a small little to-do list to show you some of the different ways that you would use the reducer for this. So now my reducer, I'm going to make it an object, and it's going to have some to-dos in it. It's going to have an empty array by default, and that's what we're going to start with. So now here my state is going to be an object, and state.todos will have this value in it. You can also destructure this if I want to, like that. So what I'm going to start with is an input field, and this input field is going to be basically, we're going to wrap it in a form. This is how we're going to add to-dos to our list. Now, a good thing to note about this is we can mix hooks all we want. So even though I have useReducer here, if I was making this, I would probably just use useState to store the state of a input field. So I'm going to say useState, and I'm going to say text set text. So I'm going to pass the value of the input text there, and then the onChange is going to be set text e.target.value. And now when this form is submitted, on submit, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a new to-do list or new to-do item on here. So I'm going to say e.prevent default value. So if you don't do this, the form will refresh the page. So we're going to do that. And so whenever someone hits the enter key, this is going to add a to-do to this. So we want to say dispatch, and our action is going to be add to-do. And the other thing you can note about actions is you can pass in other data in there that you need. So for example, I want to pass in the text. So here I'm going to say text, and that's from the useState. And so now I need to create my reducer to handle this new action that I added, add to do here. And I'm going to go ahead and say pre-json.stringify these to-dos. That way we can see what this looks like. We can see our array. So as we add to-dos and hit enter, we should see them displayed here once we add the dispatch for it. I'm also going to set text and clear out the text whenever I dispatch here. So here inside of this, I'm going to say add to do, and I'm going to get rid of decrement. So here I'm going to create a new object. I'm going to say ... state, or in this case, since we only have one item, I could just say to-dos, and I'm going to say .state.todos. So I'm going to keep all the existing to-dos, and I'm going to add one on. So I'm going to say text is equal to action.text. The other thing to note is usually you'll usually call this payload, and then the payload you may put different values in. So we could call the payload text, or we could just call it text here. It's good to note that some people will name it that way. But I'm just going to call mine text there. So I'm going to say text : action.text. One thing you'll notice if you're familiar with Redux is I tend to do it this way. I'm a little bit looser when I'm using useReducer in a single component than I am if I'm using Redux, and I need to be, following the same convention all over my entire application so it doesn't get messy. I tend to be a little bit looser when I'm just using useReducer, but maybe it's better to be stricter. Just one note I've noticed that I've been doing. And so here I'm going to say completed is going to be false. All right, so let's see this in action now. I'm going to say 1, enter, 2, and we can see our state is growing now as I add items. So cool. So now I want to display these items not like this, but just in a list. So I'm going to say todos.map, and then for each T, I'm going to display a div, and that's going to have the value, so t.text, and the key, I'm going to say t.text as well. So don't put duplicate text, or this is going to get messed up since we're using that for the key. So let's see this now. So I'm going to say 1, 2, 3, and excellent. Those are showing up. Let's go ahead and now add another action. So when I click on the to-do, I want to cross it out. So on click, I want to dispatch a new action that says toggle to do, and I want to do that at a certain index, and our map function, the second parameter, is the index. So index, we can pass that right in. So now my toggle to do up here, I can copy this case, say toggle to do. We're going to keep, actually we're going to get rid of this. We're going to do a totally different way to get this to work. So whenever I need to update the value, basically we need to go through this list, and we need to, at a certain position at that index, set completed to false or set to true, basically inverse it. So in situations where you need to update a certain item in a list, the way I like to do it is say state.todos, and I like to map over it. So the map is going to have the to-do value and then the index, and then what I do is if the index is equal to action.index, then I do a ternary, and I know this particular item when I'm mapping over is the one I need to change. Otherwise, I just return the current to do. So here I'm going to say ... to do. So I'm going to keep all those existing values in the to do, in this case just the text, and then I'm going to say completed is equal to t.completed, and then I'm going to inverse that value. So what this chunk of code does here is it's going to iterate through the list of to-dos that we have, and it's going to flip completed. So if the value is true, it's going to go to false, and we do it at a certain index. All right, so let's see that in action. We're not making a visual difference yet, so let's do that so we can actually see the change happening. So here I can say text decoration, and we can say strike. Is it strike through? This may not be right. We'll double check in a second. We're going to say t.completed is equal to that, otherwise it's an empty string. All right, so let's say 1, click. Yeah, it's not right. So I'm going to right click inspect here. I'm going to click on this item, and I'm going to say text decoration strike. Oh, is it not that? Maybe it's a different one. I thought it was maybe text transform. Nope. It's one of these properties. Text. I thought it was decoration. Oh, it's called line through. All right, so we'll rename that. So this is also, by the way, you get auto completion here, and if you open the inspector elements and then go to styles, that's what I was doing here to try to figure that out. So 1, and I click this, you can see it toggles on and off as I click it now. So pretty cool. And so that's the gist of useReducer. you'll have an initial state of some sort. You'll pass a function that's a reducer, and that reducer is going to handle different actions throughout your application, and then you're going to call dispatch to trigger those actions. You're going to pass any data you may have in. You're going to pass a type, and then your reducer is going to handle updating the state. So all your logic of updating the state goes in here. So why do people like using this over useState? What is nice about it? Well, our state here is relatively simple, but when you get into more complex state, it's nice to be able to change multiple things in the state based on actions. So what is an example of that? Well, let's say we also want to store the number of to-dos we have. So maybe the to-do count. So we'll set it to 0. So whenever we add a to-do, we not only want to add something to the to-do now, we also want to increment add to-do, or sorry, to-do count. So now I say state.todo count plus 1. So now you can see, and we should also keep to-do count is equal to state.todo count whenever we toggle the to-do here. So now you can see, and let's actually verify if this works, and then I'll talk more about that. So number of to-dos, and now we can display that. We can destructure it from up here, to-do count. And let me just make sure I didn't say to-dos. Yep, good. All right, so I can say 1, 2, 3, and we can see it's now counting there. So as you can see, as we get more complex state, a single action might map to multiple things in the state changing. And so it's very easy to put that logic in a reducer like this. So for those of you that are wondering when should you use useState versus useReducer, because that's really the question that's going to come up next, because you can use them both for storing state. I have a video that goes more in depth over this question. I'll link it below if you want to view it. But the short answer is whenever your state gets more complex, use useReducer. If something you have is very simple, you can use useState. And I think that's the distinction I usually use. The other thing to note is if you're familiar with Redux, you'll notice this is very similar. So when should you be using useReducer over useRedux? Again, I have another video, I believe, going over that. So I'll link that below as well. But the short answer for that one is if you're using the state in a single component, for example, in this app, I have it all inside of here. I like using useReducer. If you want to use this state in multiple components and they're spread out and that state relies on each other, that's when I like using Redux or another state management library rather than putting useReducer and maybe sticking context with it and trying to spread stuff out that way or passing down props. I much prefer Redux or state management libraries in that scenario. So that's that. One last thing that I wanted to mention with this is you'll notice the logic with this can get quite ugly, especially if this is a very nested object. Having to create a something immutable in that we don't want to change the value of the state is kind of annoying sometimes. So I highly recommend looking at this library called useEffect if this is a problem you have, because basically what it allows you to do is you can mutate the state, and basically underneath the hood it'll handle making an immutable change for you. And so this can be very helpful when dealing with large states in reducers, and it works for useState as well. So I highly recommend looking at this if you get some complex useReducer logic. But there you go. That is an introduction to useReducer. So we're going to be taking a look at the useContext hook. Now, one of the most frequently asked questions I get about this is how you can store a user in the context and share it throughout your application. So in this video, we're going to be using the useContext hook to do just that. So what I have set up here is a small application using React Router. What it looks like is I have a single page or 2 pages. I have an about page and a home page, and you can toggle back and forth between them. And so what I want to do is I want to be able to grid the user or who the current user is on both the home page and the about page. So that's what we're going to do in this video. Now the code for this is right here. This is my router. So I have a navigation bar that's being displayed on each page, and then I have React Router DOM router and a route that's displaying an index in an about page. Now my index looks like this, and my about page looks like this. So very basic components. We just have an H2 that is being displayed. So let's go ahead and get started with this. So the first thing that I want to do is create a context to share between my components. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new file, and I'm going to call it the userContext.js. And I'm going to import from React, and what I'm going to import is create context. And I'm going to say export const userContext is equal to create context. And here I can pass in what I want the initial value to be. In this case, I'm going to have the initial value be null. So now this user context, I'm going to import in my app over here. So I'm going to say, and I'm going to wrap the components in a provider. Now this is going to encompass all my components that I want to be able to grab the state from. So for example, if I want to get in my index in my about page, both of those components, if I want to get the user context value, then in my provider I need to wrap these two. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say userContext.provider, and this is a component which I wrap around whatever components I want to supply, be able to get the context for. Alright, so I have my provider here, and then I can pass some kind of value. So the value I'm going to pass is just hello from context. So now what I can do is any of the children components inside of this provider, I can get the value. So how do I do that? Well, let's start with the index page over here. So I can say const message is equal to useContext. So we're going to use the useContext hook. And now we pass in the context that we want to get the value for. In this case is this user context that we created. I'm going to copy that over, and I'm going to import that. And so now I can display this message. So I'm going to display a div here, and I can display my message. So now if I go to the home page and give this a refresh, oh, did I crash things? Nope, I just forgot to restart it. So we'll restart this back up. So now when we go to our home page, we're going to see our h2 element home, and then we're also going to see our div element with the message, which is going to be the value of the value in the context. And that's this value right here that we're passing to the provider. All right, so now we can see hello from context. Now on our about page, still blank. So we can grab the same context value over here, and we can display it the same way. So I'm going to copy this, paste it here, and this is the about page. And let's import this stuff. It's not going to let me auto import that one, but it would let me do it there. And now we can get this on both pages. So the advantage of using context is we can get the value of something no matter where the position this is in the component tree. So this could be a deep child, and we can access the user context by saying the useContext hook. Now we can make this more advanced by changing the value that's being stored in the provider, and then everyone is going to get the update. So what do I mean by that? Well, so I'm going to say const useState up here, and this is just going to store the state of the value. So in this case, you can say hello from context, and import useState. So this can be value, and we have set value. So now what I can do is in my provider here, I can pass in an object, which is value and set value. And now in my components over here, I'm going to move this over to the side. Actually, I think we're done with useContext. I'm just going to close it. So now in my components, I can get a value and a set value. So we'll display a value there, copy this, and do it in our about page too. And now over here, I can say set value when I want to. So button change value, and we're going to on click and set the value to hey. So now we'll refresh this. Oh, I guess we're on the about page. I was like, why aren't we seeing any difference? All right, so now when I click change value here, you'll notice the value here changes, and now when I go to my about page, it also changes here. So basically, whenever the context value is changing or that provider value is changing, we're going to get the changes through useContext. And we can access whatever we pass in as a value here. In this case, the value and set value. Now, if we want to, you'll notice we're creating a object every single time to pass into value. One thing we could do here, as we learned, is we can use the useMemo hook to create what the value is. So here I'm going to say provider value is equal to useMemo, and here we're going to return an object, the value and set value. And I want to do this whenever value and set value changes. So provider value. In this case, this is not going to make a huge difference, but if your component is making a lot of changes, the value of the object is always going to change. So this prevents this provider value from changing unless the value or set value changes. Okay, so let's take this to the next level now. So now you've seen how we can pass some state and throughout basically multiple components using useContext, and how we can pass also an object and get functions that we can actually call. And we can update the state, and we can update that state across multiple components. So the next step is to actually start storing a user. And so basically we're going to do the same thing with a user. So here we're going to start with a null value. We do not have a user. And then we may have, for example, a login. So here I'm going to say login. And by the way, I can change this to be user and set user. I think that's better. So set user and user. And I can just rename this to value if I want to. Also good to note, you can push F2 and VS Code, and then I'll let you rename something, and it will change it all over the place. So now we can say user and set user in our context. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to display the user by saying json.stringify user, and we're going to do pre-tags here, and I'm going to say null 2. And this is going to be set user. And I'm going to copy this to my about page over here. So user, set user. In case we want to set the user in the about page, we probably are not going to, but in case you want to, you have access to that. So now in my index, we want to log in the user. So how might we log in a user? So I'm going to make this an asynchronous function here. And now when I click on this button, I'm going to get the current user by logging them in. So, oops, login. And I'm going to import this. Now this is a function that I just created here, login over here. It's not letting me auto import it, which is making me sad. Now it is, I just had to open it up. So for the sake of this, I'm just mocking this login function, but it returns an object which is the current user. Now, of course, in your application, you want to go ahead and make a request to the server, for example, and get the user if they logged in correctly, but you get the idea. So we log in, we get the current user, and we can store it in our context like this. All right. So now let's look at our application over here. We can see the user is not there to start off with, and I guess this is the about. I keep coming to the about page and wondering where my button is. So now if I log in, we can see the user shows up. And so now I can do fun stuff like I can conditionally render buttons. So I can say if we have a user, display a logout button. If we do not have a user, display a login button. So I just added a ternary here. So if we have a user, log out, otherwise this. So then our on click here, I can call logout to my server if I need to, and I can say set user is equal to null, right? So now I can see I can log in, we have a user in our context, and now I can log out and it's null. And now the cool thing about this is affecting all the different pages that need the user. So my about over here is null. If I log in, you see the about has the current user. And then we can come back again and we can log out, and you get the gist. So the point is that is how one way you can go about storing the user and passing it throughout all your components and get that value using context. The gist of it is at a top level, you store in some state the current user, and then you allow other people to see that user by creating a context and passing the value down. And then those components subscribe using useContext. And now whenever that user changes, we get a new value in our state here. So there you go. That is how you can use useContext hook in React.